The summer heat in Beverly Hills was particularly intense that August morning when Henry Parker's Tesla pulled into his private garage for the last time. The air conditioning hummed softly as he sat there for a moment, staring at the dashboard clock, 7:43 a.m. He had no way of knowing these would be his final moments. Henry had always been the guy everyone wanted to know. At 42, he built his tech company from scratch, turning a small startup in his garage into a billion-dollar enterprise that specialized in cybersecurity software. He wasn't just rich, he was the kind of wealthy that made other millionaires jealous. But unlike many of his peers who flaunted their success with flashy cars and outrageous parties, Henry maintained a relatively modest lifestyle. Well, modest by Beverly Hills standards. His 3-bedroom house on North Alpine Drive wasn't the biggest on the block, but it was home. The Spanish colonial revival-style building with its terracotta roof and white stucco walls held 15 years of memories, including the moment 6 months ago when he first met Julia at a charity gala he'd hosted in his backyard. Julia Martinez had swept into his life like a fresh breeze, catching everyone's attention with her infectious laugh and genuine interest in Henry's passion project, a foundation that helped underprivileged kids learn coding. At 34, she worked as a marketing executive for a competing tech firm, or so she claimed. Her understanding of the industry had impressed Henry, and their shared love for classic movies and Thai food seemed too perfect to be coincidental. Their whirlwind romance became the talk of their social circle. Friends noticed how Henry seemed younger, more energetic around Julia. She moved in after just 3 months of dating, bringing with her an extensive collection of designer clothes and a seemingly endless supply of optimism that brightened every room she entered. The proposal happened on a regular Tuesday evening. Henry had cooked dinner, his signature pasta carbonara, and they were sitting on the patio, sharing a bottle of wine. The ring was nothing flashy, a vintage piece from Tiffany's that Julia had casually pointed out during one of their weekend shopping trips. She'd said yes before he could even finish asking the question, tears streaming down her face as she hugged him tightly. The next morning, Henry disappeared. Julia's first call to the police came exactly 48 hours later. Her voice trembled as she explained to the 911 operator that her fiancé had left for what was supposed to be a quick business trip to San Francisco, but he hadn't returned. She said he'd packed a small overnight bag, kissed her goodbye, and promised to call when he landed. That call never came. The initial response from law enforcement was routine. Adults go missing all the time, only to turn up a few days later after an unplanned adventure or a stress-induced timeout. But something about this case felt different to Detective Sarah Chun, a veteran of the Beverly Hills Police Department's Missing Persons Unit. Chun had seen her fair share of wealthy people disappearing, usually involving ransom demands or carefully planned escapes from failing marriages. But Henry Parker didn't fit either profile. His company was thriving, his engagement had just been announced, and his bank account showed no unusual activity. In fact, nothing had been touched since the morning he vanished. The first red flags appeared during Chen's initial walkthrough of the house. Everything looked perfect, too perfect. The bed was made with hospital corners, the kitchen counters gleamed, and even the garage floor sparkled like it had been recently mopped. In Chen's experience, nowhere in a lived-in home should be that clean, especially not a garage. Julia followed the detective around, providing a running commentary about their daily routines, their future plans, the wedding they'd started to plan. She was the picture of distress, designer clothes slightly rumpled, makeup tastefully smudged, voice catching at all the right moments. But Chun couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about her performance. The detective's instincts proved right when the forensics team arrived. Under the powerful UV lights, the garage told a different story. Traces of blood had seeped into the tiny cracks between the concrete blocks, invisible to the naked eye, but impossible to completely erase. The pattern suggested a significant amount of blood had been spilled and then meticulously cleaned up. When confronted with this discovery, Julia's demeanor shifted subtly. Her hands, which had been constantly fidgeting with her engagement ring, suddenly went still. The tears, which had flowed freely during the initial interview, dried up. She asked for a lawyer before Chin could even finish explaining what they'd found. The investigation accelerated quickly after that. A search warrant revealed more inconsistencies in Julia's carefully constructed narrative. Henry's passport was still in his desk drawer, despite her claim that he'd taken it for the business trip. His phone had last pinged from their home's Wi-Fi network hours after she said he'd left for the airport. And perhaps most damning, security camera footage showed Julia making 3 trips to a nearby hardware store in the 2 days before she reported him missing. The garage wasn't the only place hiding secrets. In Henry's home office, detectives found a half-written email to his lawyer, saved as a draft but never sent. The message detailed his concerns about Julia's spending habits and his plans to protect his assets before the wedding. He discovered something that made him wary, but the email didn't specify what had triggered his suspicion. Julia's background began to unravel under scrutiny. The marketing executive position she claimed to hold didn't exist. She'd never worked for the company she named as her employer. Her college degree from Stanford turned out to be fake, and her supposed family wealth was non-existent. She'd crafted an entirely fictional persona, one designed to attract exactly the kind of man Henry was. Friends and family came forward with stories they'd been too polite to share before. Henry's sister remembered Julia's strange reaction when Henry mentioned updating his will. His best friend recalled catching Julia in several small lies about her past. His housekeeper noted that Julia had asked detailed questions about the security system and Henry's schedule within days of moving in. The breaking point came 3 weeks into the investigation. A highway patrol officer found Henry's overnight bag in a dumpster behind a rest stop 50 miles north of Los Angeles. Inside was everything Julia had claimed he'd packed for his trip, but a receipt in the side pocket was dated 2 days before he supposedly left. When confronted with this evidence, Julia's carefully constructed facade finally cracked. Her confession came in pieces, between sobs and attempts to justify her actions. She admitted to killing Henry in the garage, claiming it wasn't planned but happened during an argument about the prenuptial agreement he'd surprised her with. According to Julia, he'd threatened to expose her lies, to ruin the life she'd worked so hard to create. In her version of events, she'd acted in panic, grabbing a heavy wrench from his toolbox and striking him before she could think about the consequences. But the physical evidence told a different story. The blood spatter analysis suggested Henry had been struck multiple times, including several blows after he'd already fallen. The murder weapon was never found, but investigators discovered a receipt for a set of tools Julia had purchased and later returned to a different hardware store location. The level of cleanup, the careful disposal of evidence, and her calculated behavior in the days following the murder all pointed to premeditation. The truth that emerged was far more calculating than a crime of passion. Julia had targeted Henry specifically, spending months studying his habits and preferences before engineering their chance meeting at the charity gala. She'd created her entire persona based on what she thought would appeal to him, right down to her claimed interest in coding and classic movies. The engagement had been her endgame, a way to secure her position before Henry could discover her deceptions. The investigation revealed that Julia Martinez wasn't even her real name. She was born Amanda Pierce in a small town in Nevada, and Henry wasn't her first victim, just her most ambitious target. She had a history of dating wealthy men, though she'd never gone as far as murder before. Previous relationships had ended when her lies were discovered or when her targets became suspicious of her intentions. As Detective Chin built the case against her, Julia's behavior became increasingly erratic. She alternated between claiming complete innocence and trying to negotiate a plea deal, between tearful remorse and cold indifference. The woman who had so carefully maintained her polished image now seemed to be cycling through personalities, unable to decide which would serve her best. The media descended on Beverly Hills like vultures, turning Henry's tragedy into prime-time entertainment. Every detail of the case was dissected on news shows and true crime podcasts. Julia's previous identities and schemes became public knowledge, and more victims of her past cons came forward. The story captured public attention not just because of its sensational nature, but because it tapped into a universal fear that the person sharing your life could be wearing a mask. For the investigators, the case became a lesson in how appearances can deceive. Julia had played the role of grieving fiancée perfectly, down to the smallest detail. She'd known exactly how to act, what to say, and when to break down. Her performance had been so convincing that even experienced detectives had initially believed her story. It was only the physical evidence, the blood that couldn't be completely cleaned away, the receipts she'd forgotten to destroy, the security cameras she'd overlooked that had revealed the truth behind her carefully constructed lies. The story of Henry Parker's murder sparked intense discussions across social media. People couldn't help but wonder, how well do we really know the ones we love? Comments flooded news articles and Reddit threads, with readers sharing their own experiences of betrayal and close calls with manipulative partners. The case hit home for many, especially those who had built substantial wealth through hard work and found themselves wondering who they could trust. Trust, it was a word that kept coming up in conversations about the case. Henry Parker had trusted Julia with everything, his home, his heart, and nearly his fortune. His death forced many successful entrepreneurs to take a hard look at their own relationships. Private investigators in Beverly Hills reported a surge in requests for background checks on fiancés and longtime partners. Prenuptial agreement filings doubled in the months following Henry's murder. As more details emerged about Julia's deception, the investigation revealed just how meticulously she had planned her integration into Henry's life. Security footage from the charity gala where they first met showed her arriving unusually early, positioning herself near the bar where Henry typically ordered his favorite scotch. She'd even worn a dress in the exact shade of blue that Henry's late mother had often worn, a detail she'd learned from studying photos in magazine articles about his success story. Their seemingly perfect relationship had been a masterclass in manipulation. Julia had spent months learning Henry's schedule, his likes and dislikes, his dreams and fears. She knew when he took his morning coffee breaks at the local cafe, which hiking trails he preferred on weekends, and which classic movies he quoted most often. Every coincidental, shared interest had been carefully researched and rehearsed. The tension that friends had noticed wasn't just pre-wedding jitters, as everyone had assumed. Henry's executive assistant recalled overhearing heated phone conversations in the weeks before his death. He'd been asking questions about Julia's past, making calls to Stanford's alumni office and her supposed former employers. His digital footprint showed late-night searches about her background, suggesting he'd begun to see through her facade. Email records recovered from Henry's cloud storage painted a picture of growing suspicion. He'd hired a private investigator 2 weeks before his death, but had told no one about it. The investigator's preliminary report, found in Henry's desk drawer, contained red flags about Julia's identity. Henry had scheduled a meeting with his lawyer for the day after he disappeared, a meeting he'd never lived to attend. Julia's own digital trail revealed the extent of her research. Her laptop, seized during the investigation, contained folders dedicated to Henry's habits and preferences. She'd maintained detailed spreadsheets tracking his routines, his business contacts, and his financial holdings. One document listed potential ways to access his accounts once they were married, complete with notes about banks' security protocols. The cleanup after the murder hadn't been improvised either. Julia had purchased cleaning supplies and tools weeks in advance, storing them in a rented storage unit across town. She'd researched methods for removing bloodstains and had even practiced cleaning techniques on old carpet samples. The level of preparation suggested she'd been ready for violence long before the confrontation that ended Henry's life. Investigators found practice signatures in her notebooks, dozens of pages where she'd perfected Henry's handwriting. She'd been preparing to forge documents, though whether she'd planned to use this skill before or after his death remained unclear. The discovery sent forensic accountants scrambling to review every document Henry had supposedly signed in the months leading up to his murder. The psychological profile developed by FBI analysts suggested Julia was a rare type of predator, one who combined the manipulation skills of a con artist with the calculating nature of a premeditated murderer. She hadn't just wanted Henry's money, she'd wanted to completely possess his life, to step into the world he'd built and claim it as her own. When he'd threatened to expose her lies, she'd chosen to eliminate him rather than lose her chance at the life she coveted. Julia's internet search history revealed a disturbing pattern. She'd researched other wealthy men in the area, creating detailed profiles of potential targets. Henry hadn't been her first choice. He was third on a list of prospective marks, selected because his relatively private lifestyle made him more vulnerable to her approach. The other men on her list had more public profiles and stronger social networks, making them harder to isolate and control. The case fascinated criminologists who studied predatory behavior. Julia didn't fit the usual profile of a black widow or a gold digger. Her methods were more sophisticated, her planning more thorough. She'd created multiple backup plans and escape routes, including a set of false documents that would have allowed her to assume a new identity after marrying Henry. The only thing she hadn't planned for was Henry discovering her true identity before she could secure her position. As investigators dug deeper into Julia's past, they uncovered a pattern of escalating deceptions. Her previous relationships had followed a similar script. She would identify a wealthy target, create a persona tailored to their preferences, and integrate herself into their lives. But each time, something had gone wrong before she could achieve her ultimate goal of financial control. The timeline of her activities revealed an increasingly desperate pattern. Her first known con had been relatively simple. A 6-month relationship with a real estate developer in Seattle ended when he discovered her fake employment history. She'd walked away with some expensive gifts and access to his credit cards, but nothing substantial enough to maintain the lifestyle she desired. Her second major target had been a divorced cryptocurrency investor in San Francisco. That relationship had lasted nearly a year, ending when his teenage daughter hired a private investigator out of suspicion. Julia had managed to secure a small fortune in Bitcoin before disappearing, but the volatile market had wiped out most of her gains within months. Each failed relationship had taught her something new, helping her refine her techniques. She learned to bypass standard background checks by creating better false documentation. She studied the habits of wealthy families, learning how to mirror their mannerisms and social expectations. By the time she met Henry, she had perfected her approach. The carefully staged photos on her social media accounts showed how she'd constructed her fake identity. Each post had been designed to create a backstory that would appeal to someone like Henry, charity events, business conferences, cultural activities. She'd even maintained fake friendships with paid actors who would confirm her false history if anyone checked her references. But Henry had been different from her previous targets. Unlike the others, who had been attracted primarily to her carefully crafted exterior, Henry had genuinely connected with the person she pretended to be. This deeper emotional connection seemed to have affected Julia in unexpected ways. Detective Chen found journal entries suggesting Julia had actually begun to care for Henry, making her eventual decision to kill him even more chilling. The prosecution would later argue that this emotional attachment had made Julia more dangerous, not less. When Henry began to uncover her lies, she faced not just the loss of a potential fortune but the destruction of a fantasy life she'd begun to believe in. The violence of his murder suggested both practical calculation and emotional rage, a combination that made her actions particularly disturbing. Friends who had witnessed their relationship described moments that, in hindsight, showed cracks in Julia's performance. At dinner parties, she sometimes slipped in her stories, mixing up details about her supposed past. When discussing her fake Stanford years, she'd occasionally mention buildings or professors that didn't exist. These mistakes were small enough to be dismissed in the moment, but formed a pattern that Henry had eventually begun to notice. The technical evidence against Julia mounted quickly once investigators knew where to look. Her cell phone had connected to the home's Wi-Fi network throughout the time she claimed to be searching for Henry. Her car's GPS showed trips to remote areas in the days following his disappearance, though searches of these locations failed to locate Henry's body. Security cameras caught her disposing of items in dumpsters across the city, though most of the evidence had been removed before police could recover it. The most damning evidence came from Henry's own security system. He had installed state-of-the-art cameras throughout his property, backing up footage to a cloud server Julia hadn't known about. While she had managed to delete the local recordings from the day of the murder, the cloud backup captured everything. The footage showed Henry arriving home that morning, followed by sounds of an argument and then silence. Hours later, it recorded Julia making multiple trips to her car with heavy garbage bags. As the evidence mounted, Julia's behavior in custody became increasingly erratic. She cycled through different personalities, sometimes presenting as the polished professional she'd pretended to be, other times revealing glimpses of her true self, angry, calculating, and utterly without remorse. Her jail cell conversations, recorded by authorities, revealed her primary concern wasn't the charges against her, but the assets she'd failed to secure. The case attracted nationwide attention, with major news networks running special reports on the dangers of romance scams and financial predators. Security consultants appeared on morning shows offering advice about protecting oneself from similar cons. Henry's story became a cautionary tale about the dark side of modern dating, where carefully curated online personas can hide dangerous truths. For the investigators, the case highlighted how technology had created new opportunities for predators like Julia. She had used social media to study her targets, digital tools to create false identities, and modern banking systems to hide her finances. But ultimately, the same technology had helped expose her crimes, capturing the digital breadcrumbs she couldn't completely erase. Detective Chin sat at her desk, staring at the wall of evidence that had taken over her office. Photos, timeline charts, and sticky notes covered nearly every inch of space, all connected by red strings that tracked Julia's movements and deceptions. The case had consumed the department for weeks, and each new discovery seemed to reveal another layer of calculated manipulation. The laptop found in Julia's designer handbag became a goldmine of information. Tech experts recovered deleted files that showed just how deep her deception went. She had spreadsheets tracking Henry's daily routines, down to when he liked to take his afternoon coffee break. There were folders full of research on his business dealings, family connections, and banking habits. One document contained a detailed timeline for their relationship, planning everything from their accidental first meeting to their eventual marriage. The investigation team discovered Julia had rented a small apartment across town under a different name. Inside, they found what could only be described as a command center for her operation. The walls were covered with photos of Henry taken months before they officially met. Handwritten notes detailed his preferences in food, music, and even the cologne he wore. She had studied him like a hunter studying prey, learning his patterns and vulnerabilities. More disturbing were the practice videos they found on her phone. Julia had recorded herself practicing different personas: the charming businesswoman, the vulnerable romantic, the supportive partner. She would spend hours perfecting her expressions, her laugh, even the way she walked. Each version of herself was carefully crafted to appeal to different aspects of Henry's personality. The building security cameras at Henry's office revealed Julia had been watching him long before their first meeting. Footage showed her sitting in her car outside his building multiple times in the months leading up to the charity gala. She'd even followed him to his favorite lunch spots, timing her own appearances to seem coincidental. The level of stalking was methodical and patient. Bank records painted a picture of financial desperation behind Julia's polished exterior. Before meeting Henry, she had maxed out credit cards and taken out high-interest loans. She had been just weeks away from bankruptcy when she put her plan into action. The money she claimed came from family wealth was actually borrowed from loan sharks, used to maintain her expensive facade while she worked her way into Henry's life. The investigation uncovered a series of storage units rented under different names. Each contained elements of different identities: clothes, documents, and personal items that could transform Julia into whatever person she needed to be. One unit held equipment for document forgery, including high-quality printers and paper stock matching what banks used for official documents. Former boyfriends started coming forward with similar stories. They described a woman who seemed perfect at first, who shared all their interests and supported all their dreams. Each relationship had followed the same pattern: intense romance followed by increasing financial entanglement. The only difference with Henry was that he had started asking questions before she could secure her position. Text messages recovered from Henry's phone showed he had begun to notice inconsistencies in Julia's stories. He had texted his sister about Julia's reaction when he mentioned hiring a new accounting firm to handle their future joint finances. She got weird about it, he wrote. Like she was trying too hard to seem okay with it. That text was sent 3 days before his death. The evidence suggested Henry had started his own investigation into Julia's background. His browser history showed searches for private investigators and background check services. He had contacted Stanford's alumni office and her supposed former employers. Each inquiry would have sent alerts to the fake references Julia had set up, letting her know her cover was being blown. The murder itself appeared to have been planned well in advance. Julia had purchased cleaning supplies and heavy-duty trash bags weeks before Henry's death. Security footage from a hardware store showed her buying a set of tools, including a heavy wrench matching the suspected murder weapon. She had even tested different cleaning products on samples of garage floor concrete, determining which would best remove blood stains. Detective Chin found herself particularly troubled by Julia's behavior in the days following the murder. She had attended a charity event the very next evening, laughing and socializing as if nothing had happened. She had even posted on social media about missing Henry, creating a public timeline that supported her story about his business trip. The posts were carefully worded to establish an alibi while appearing genuinely concerned. The breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected source. A teenage neighbor's drone had captured footage of Julia's late-night activities in the garage. The boy, an aspiring filmmaker, had been practicing night flying with his new drone's infrared camera. The grainy thermal imaging showed Julia making multiple trips between the garage and her car in the early morning hours after Henry's disappearance. Forensics teams found traces of blood despite Julia's thorough cleaning. Using luminol and advanced detection techniques, they reconstructed the crime scene. The blood spatter pattern told a story that contradicted Julia's claim of self-defense. The evidence showed Henry had been struck from behind first, suggesting he had been caught completely unaware. The garage floor contained another crucial piece of evidence. Tiny fragments of glass from Henry's watch had been ground into the concrete. The watch, a beloved gift from his father, was never found. But those fragments helped establish the timeline of events and proved that the attack had happened in the garage, not in self-defense during an argument, as Julia had claimed. Julia's cell phone records revealed calls to a burner phone in the hours after Henry's death. The number was eventually traced to a former cellmate from her brief stint in county jail years earlier, under a different name. This contact had helped dispose of evidence, including Henry's phone and personal effects. The accomplice later agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence. The police conducted extensive searches of the areas where Julia's car had been tracked by GPS. While Henry's body was never found, they discovered other evidence she had tried to dispose of, including bloody clothing and the registration papers for one of her storage units. Each discovery added another piece to the puzzle of her elaborate plan. Henry's family provided crucial information about changes in his behavior during his relationship with Julia. His sister recalled how he had become more reserved at family gatherings, less willing to discuss his business decisions. Friends noticed he had started keeping important documents in a safe at his office instead of his home office. He had sensed something was wrong but hadn't been able to put the pieces together in time. The investigation revealed Julia had already started laying groundwork for her next identity. A passport under a new name was found in one of her storage units, along with credit cards and bank accounts set up with stolen identities. She had planned to disappear after securing access to Henry's accounts, leaving behind both Julia Martinez and her true identity of Amanda Pierce. Professional imposters interviewed by the police explained how Julia's techniques followed a familiar pattern. She had used a combination of social engineering and careful research to create a persona that would appeal specifically to Henry. Her approach was described as a long con, where the perpetrator invests months or even years in establishing trust before making their move. The evidence showed Julia had taken advantage of Henry's past trauma, the loss of his parents at a young age and a previous relationship that had ended badly. She had positioned herself as someone who understood his pain, who shared his drive and ambition. Her manipulation had been both psychological and emotional, making her betrayal even more profound. Detective Chen's team discovered Julia had maintained detailed journals documenting her various cons. The writings revealed a calculating mind that viewed relationships as tactical operations. She had notes analyzing her target's weaknesses, documenting their habits, and planning how to exploit their vulnerabilities. Henry's section was the most extensive, suggesting he had been her most ambitious target yet. Financial investigators uncovered attempts to access Henry's accounts even after his death. Julia had tried to transfer funds using forged documents and digital signatures. The attempts failed only because Henry's recent suspicions had led him to add extra security measures to his accounts. His caution, even if too late to save his life, had protected his legacy. The most chilling discovery came from Julia's internet search history in the weeks before the murder. She had researched methods of dissolving bodies, ways to disable security systems, and techniques for establishing alibis. The searches showed she had contemplated murder long before Henry began investigating her background, suggesting his discoveries had simply accelerated her timeline rather than triggered an unplanned response. The district attorney's office buzzed with activity as prosecutors prepared their case against Julia. Lead prosecutor Michael Santos had handled hundreds of murder cases in his 20-year career, but something about this one kept him up at night. Maybe it was the way Julia could switch personas in an instant, or perhaps it was the calculated nature of her deception that made this case particularly disturbing. The prosecution team worked closely with Henry's family, particularly his sister Rachel, who became their key ally in understanding the victim's state of mind in his final days. Rachel had kept every text message, every email, and every voicemail from her brother. These communications painted a picture of a man slowly realizing he was in danger, but trying to handle it privately to avoid embarrassment. "He called me the night before he died," Rachel told the prosecutors during a preparation meeting. She sat in Santos's office, clutching a coffee cup with shaking hands. "He said he needed to tell me something important, but wanted to do it in person. We were supposed to have lunch the next day." Her voice cracked. He never made it. The investigation into Henry's finances revealed he had been quietly moving assets around in the weeks before his death. His company's CFO provided emails showing Henry had been asking about ways to protect his business interests. He had scheduled meetings with 3 different law firms specializing in asset protection, all set for the week after he disappeared. Julia's defense team tried to spin this financial activity as proof that Henry had planned to leave, suggesting he might still be alive somewhere. But the evidence told a different story. Bank security footage showed Henry withdrawing documents from his safe deposit box 2 days before his death. Among them was a USB drive containing what would turn out to be crucial evidence about Julia's past. Detective Chen's team discovered Henry had hired not 1 but 3 private investigators to look into Julia's background. Each had been given different aspects of her life to investigate: her education, her employment history, and her family connections. All 3 investigations were closing in on the truth about her identity when Henry was killed. The prosecution built their case methodically, focusing on Julia's pattern of deception. They created a timeline that showed how she had orchestrated every aspect of her relationship with Henry. Security footage from the charity gala where they met showed Julia arriving hours early, studying the layout and positioning herself perfectly to create their chance encounter. Henry's executive assistant proved to be another valuable witness. She had noticed small inconsistencies in Julia's behavior, moments when her story would change slightly or when she would react oddly to casual questions about her past. The assistant had started keeping notes, sensing something wasn't right but not sure what to do about it. The case took an unexpected turn when investigators found a safety deposit box registered to one of Julia's aliases. Inside were detailed plans for what she called her exit strategy, documents prepared to transfer Henry's assets after their marriage, followed by a carefully planned disappearance that would have made it look like she had been a victim too. Forensic accountants traced Julia's financial activities back several years, uncovering a complex web of fraud and identity theft. She had maintained multiple personas simultaneously, each with its own bank accounts, credit cards, and documented history. The level of organization was staggering, suggesting years of practice and preparation. Working with Henry's family gave the prosecution team insights into the psychological manipulation Julia had employed. She had studied Henry's relationship with his late parents, particularly his mother, and had modeled aspects of her behavior to subtly remind him of his mother's caring nature. This calculated exploitation of his grief added another layer of horror to her crimes. The prosecutors were particularly interested in Julia's activities in the days immediately following Henry's murder. Security cameras from local businesses showed her shopping for home decor, having lunch with friends, and even attending a yoga class. Her apparent calm during this period, while methodically disposing of evidence, spoke to her sociopathic tendencies. As the case progressed, more people from Henry's circle came forward with information. His personal trainer remembered Julia asking detailed questions about Henry's schedule and routines, far beyond what a normal fiancé might want to know. The trainer had found it odd but hadn't wanted to seem paranoid by mentioning it. The building manager at Henry's office revealed that Julia had attempted to gain access to his private office several times before they were engaged, claiming to be delivering surprise gifts or documents. Each attempt had been logged in the security system, creating a pattern of behavior that showed her trying to infiltrate his professional life. Technology played a crucial role in building the case. Digital forensics experts recovered deleted files from Julia's cloud storage accounts, revealing dozens of practice videos where she rehearsed different versions of her Julia Martinez persona. In some videos, she practiced Henry's signature. In others, she rehearsed emotional reactions to various scenarios, including his potential death. The prosecution team worked with psychologists to understand Julia's methodology. They discovered she had used classic manipulation techniques, love bombing in the early stages of the relationship, followed by subtle emotional manipulation and isolation from friends and family. Her approach had been textbook, but executed with unusual precision. Henry's family provided access to his personal journals, which showed his growing awareness of Julia's deception. His final entry, dated the day before his death, read, "Something isn't adding up with Jay. Meeting with Steve tomorrow to go over what he found. Need to be smart about how I handle this." Steve, they later learned, was one of the private investigators. The investigators' reports were damning. They had uncovered Julia's multiple identities, her history of fraud, and her connections to other suspected con artists. The report showed she was part of a larger network of scammers who shared techniques and information about potential targets. Henry had stumbled onto something much bigger than a single case of fraud. Rachel became instrumental in helping prosecutors understand her brother's state of mind. She shared stories about their childhood, helping to explain why Henry might have been vulnerable to Julia's particular brand of manipulation. Their parents' early death had left him with a deep desire for family connection, something Julia had expertly exploited. The prosecution team also focused on Julia's previous victims, building a pattern of behavior that would help convince a jury this wasn't a crime of passion. They found 5 other wealthy men she had targeted over the years, each case following a similar pattern but stopping short of violence. Henry had been different only because he had gotten too close to exposing her. Julia's cell phone records provided crucial timeline evidence. The prosecution mapped her movements in the days before and after Henry's death, showing how she had systematically cleaned up evidence and created alibis. She had even posted on social media about missing Henry while actively disposing of evidence related to his murder. The case attracted national media attention, with several true crime shows producing specials about Julia's schemes. The prosecution team had to work carefully to prevent media coverage from contaminating their jury pool. They focused on building a case that would stand on physical evidence and witness testimony rather than sensational details. Financial investigators uncovered attempts to access Henry's accounts even after his death. Julia had created elaborate forgeries of his signature and had attempted to transfer funds using digital banking tools. The attempts had failed only because of security measures Henry had put in place during his last days, seemingly anticipating trouble. The prosecution's case was strengthened by evidence of Julia's continued deception even after her arrest. Jail recordings caught her attempting to manipulate other inmates and guards, using the same techniques she had employed with Henry. She was also recorded making calls to contacts outside, trying to access hidden accounts and move evidence. As the case moved toward trial, the prosecution team felt confident in their evidence, but remained concerned about Julia's ability to manipulate a jury. They had seen her switch personas effortlessly during interviews and preliminary hearings. Santos knew they would need to focus on the physical evidence, the blood evidence, the financial records, the surveillance footage, rather than relying on witness testimony alone. Henry's family remained deeply involved in the case P. Reparation, determined to see justice done. Rachel attended every pretrial hearing, watching Julia carefully and providing insights into her brother's behavior in the months leading up to his death. The family's presence served as a constant reminder of the human cost of Julia's crimes. The Los Angeles County Superior Court buzzed with tension on the first day of Julia's trial. News vans lined the street outside, and the courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and curious onlookers. Inside, the security team had to set up extra metal detectors to handle the crowd of spectators hoping to witness what had become known as the Black Widow of Beverly Hills case. Julia made her entrance like she was walking a red carpet rather than entering a murder trial. She had somehow managed to style her hair perfectly despite being in custody, and her navy blue dress suit looked more appropriate for a board meeting than a courtroom. Several jurors couldn't help but stare. This polished, professional-looking woman seemed at odds with the calculating killer described in the prosecution's opening statement. Prosecutor Michael Santos had seen enough murderers to know that appearances meant nothing. In his opening remarks, he painted a picture of methodical deception and cold-blooded planning. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice steady and clear, "this case isn't about a relationship gone wrong. It's about a predator who spent months stalking her prey, learning his habits, gaining his trust, and then killing him when he discovered her true nature." The prosecution's first witness was Detective Chun, who walked the jury through the initial investigation. She described entering Henry's immaculate garage, noticing the strange chemical smell that lingered despite the powerful air fresheners Julia had used. Crime scene photos showed the garage floor under ultraviolet light, revealing the faint traces of blood that refused to disappear completely. Julia's defense team, led by high-profile attorney James Morrison, tried to paint her as a victim of circumstance. They suggested Henry had been abusive, controlling, and that Julia had acted in self-defense during a heated argument about their prenuptial agreement. But their narrative fell apart when confronted with evidence of Julia's extensive planning. Security footage from various hardware stores showed Julia purchasing cleaning supplies and tools weeks before Henry's death. The timestamps on these videos directly contradicted her claim that the killing had been unplanned. One particularly damaging clip showed her testing different cleaning products on concrete samples, methodically preparing for what was to come. The jury sat in rapt attention as Henry's sister Rachel took the stand. She described her brother's growing unease in the weeks before his death, how he had begun to notice small inconsistencies in Julia's stories. "He called me late one night," Rachel testified, her voice steady despite her obvious emotion. "He said something felt off, but he couldn't put his finger on it. He was going to hire someone to look into her background. 3 days later, he was gone." The prosecution presented evidence of Julia's previous identities and cons, showing how she had refined her techniques over years of practice. Bank records revealed a pattern of targeting wealthy men, gaining their trust, and then disappearing with whatever assets she could access. Henry had been different only because he had started investigating her past before she could complete her plan. Julia maintained her composure through most of the testimony, but cracks began to show when the prosecution presented the contents of her laptop. The jury saw her detailed spreadsheets tracking Henry's movements, her practice videos perfecting different personas, and her written plans for assuming control of his assets after their marriage. Her carefully maintained facade began to slip as her true nature was exposed. The technical evidence proved particularly damaging to Julia's defense. Forensic experts explained how blood spatter analysis showed Henry had been struck from behind while kneeling, likely working on something in his garage. This directly contradicted Julia's claim of self-defense during a face-to-face confrontation. The murder weapon, though never found, was proven to be a heavy wrench based on the wound patterns and traces of metal found in the impact sites. Cell phone data placed Julia at various locations where evidence had been disposed of, contradicting her initial statements to police about searching for Henry. Her internet search history revealed queries about body disposal methods and cleaning blood from concrete, all timestamped weeks before the murder. Each piece of evidence further eroded her claims of innocence. The prosecution's case was strengthened by testimony from Julia's former cellmate, who described how Julia had bragged about her various cons while in custody for an unrelated fraud charge years earlier. The cellmate recalled Julia saying she would never be satisfied with small scams. She wanted the big score that would set her up for life. The jury seemed particularly affected by this glimpse into Julia's true personality. As the trial progressed, Julia's behavior became increasingly erratic. She would appear perfectly composed one moment, then snap at her attorneys the next. During particularly damaging testimony, observers noticed her switching between different personas, sometimes playing the grieving fiancé, other times the wrongly accused victim, and occasionally letting glimpses of cold calculation show through. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when the prosecution played the recovered security footage from Henry's home system. The grainy video showed Henry entering the garage that final morning, followed by Julia carrying what appeared to be a tool from their storage shed. The audio captured their voices, Henry confronting her about inconsistencies in her background, Julia's tone changing from defensive to threatening. Then came the sounds of struggle, a series of heavy thuds, and finally silence. Julia's reaction to the video was telling. For the first time, her carefully maintained composure completely cracked. She burst into tears, but observers noted that she seemed more angry than remorseful. Her attorneys quickly called for a recess, but the damage was done. The jury had seen both the evidence of her crime and her true emotional response to being caught. The defense tried to recover by presenting character witnesses who spoke about Julia's charitable work and community involvement. But under cross-examination, each witness was forced to admit they had only known her for the brief time she had been with Henry, and only in her carefully constructed Julia Martinez persona. None could speak to her life before meeting Henry or verify any of her claimed background. Forensic accountants testified about the complex web of financial fraud Julia had created. They showed how she had maintained multiple identities, each with its own credit cards, bank accounts, and documented history. The level of organization required for this deception impressed even veteran fraud investigators, who described it as one of the most sophisticated schemes they had encountered. The prosecution's financial evidence painted a picture of increasing desperation in the weeks before Henry's murder. Julia had been running out of money, her credit cards were maxed out, and loan sharks were demanding payment. The timing coincided with Henry's growing suspicions and his plans to protect his assets with a prenuptial agreement. The combination of financial pressure and the risk of exposure had created a perfect storm. Henry's executive assistant provided compelling testimony about Julia's attempts to access sensitive business information. She described how Julia had tried to charm her way into Henry's office after hours, always with seemingly innocent explanations. The assistant had begun keeping notes of these incidents, sensing something wasn't right, but not sure what to do about it. The defense's case suffered another blow when their expert witness, a psychologist who was supposed to testify about battered woman syndrome, withdrew after reviewing Julia's history of manipulation and fraud. The psychologist's withdrawal was particularly damaging because it suggested even professionals brought in to support Julia's story couldn't maintain that position when confronted with the evidence. Julia's past victims were allowed to testify about their experiences with her, establishing a pattern of behavior. Each man described how she had studied their interests and habits, created a persona designed to appeal to them specifically, and then begun isolating them from friends and family. The similarities between their stories and Henry's situation were striking. The prosecution's closing argument was masterful in its simplicity. Santos walked the jury through the timeline of Julia's deception, from her initial stalking of Henry to her careful planning of his murder. He showed how each piece of evidence built upon the others, creating an undeniable picture of premeditated murder motivated by greed and the fear of exposure. Henry Parker died because he discovered the truth, Santos told the jury in his closing statement. He died because he was going to expose Julia Martinez as a fraud, a con artist, and a predator. She didn't kill him in self-defense or in the heat of passion. She killed him because he was going to ruin her carefully constructed plan. She killed him to protect her lies. The defense's closing argument focused on reasonable doubt, suggesting that the prosecution's case was circumstantial despite the overwhelming physical evidence. Morrison tried to paint Julia as a misunderstood woman who had made some mistakes in her past, but truly loved Henry. His argument seemed hollow in the face of the mountain of evidence showing her calculated deception. After 7 weeks of testimony, hundreds of pieces of evidence, and dozens of witnesses, the case went to the jury. The 12 men and women who had listened to every detail of Julia's deception and Henry's murder were tasked with determining her fate. The court fell silent as they filed out to begin their deliberations. In the tense days that followed, Julia sat in her cell, writing long letters that her attorneys refused to let her send. Guards reported that she seemed to be cycling through different personalities, sometimes appearing completely disconnected from reality. The woman who had maintained such careful control throughout her con was finally falling apart as she faced the consequences of her actions. The security footage from the hardware store changed everything. The prosecution had saved this piece of evidence for last, knowing its impact would be devastating. The video showed Julia, hair tucked under a baseball cap, purchasing cleaning supplies and garbage bags just hours before Henry's death. The timestamp left no room for her claims of self-defense or unplanned violence. The footage played in complete silence in the courtroom. Frame by frame, it showed Julia carefully selecting industrial-strength cleaning products, thick rubber gloves, and heavy-duty trash bags. She paid in cash, but the store's new HD cameras caught every detail of her face. More damning was her demeanor, calm, methodical, checking items off a list on her phone as she shopped. Julia's reaction to the video marked her first real break from the composed persona she'd maintained throughout the trial. She started laughing, not the polished, social laugh she'd perfected for Henry's business events, but a harsh, uncontrolled sound that made several jurors shift uncomfortably in their seats. Her attorney tried to quiet her, but she shrugged off his hand and kept laughing until the judge ordered a recess. During the break, Julia's behavior became increasingly erratic. She refused to speak with her defense team, instead demanding paper and pen to write letters to Henry. The letters, later seized by jail staff, revealed a mind fracturing under pressure. In one paragraph, she wrote as the devoted fiancée Julia Martinez. In the next, she slipped into the voice of Amanda Pierce, her true identity, coldly calculating how she could still turn the situation to her advantage. The prosecution's forensics expert explained how the items Julia purchased matched exactly what would be needed to clean up a murder scene. He showed the jury photos of similar products being used to eliminate blood evidence, pointing out that Julia's selections showed knowledge of crime scene cleanup techniques. Her internet search history revealed she'd researched these methods extensively. As this evidence mounted, Julia's defense team struggled to maintain their strategy. They had built their case around portraying her as a victim of circumstance, a woman who had acted in desperate self-defense. But the hardware store video, combined with her increasingly unstable behavior in court, made this narrative impossible to maintain. Detective Chun took the stand again to present new evidence found in one of Julia's storage units. Hidden behind false walls, investigators had discovered a collection of items that spoke to years of planning and deception. There were dozens of fake IDs, each crafted with professional skill. Boxes of documents showed she'd been studying Henry long before their chance meeting, including detailed notes about his habits, preferences, and vulnerabilities. The storage unit also contained what prosecutors called her exit kit, everything needed to disappear after completing her con. New passports, credit cards in various names, and detailed plans for assuming a new identity. Most chilling was a document outlining various scenarios for Henry's death, including accidents, suicide, and disappearance. She had planned multiple ways to kill him, choosing the garage scene only when her timeline was accelerated by his discoveries. Julia's former cellmate testified about conversations they'd had years earlier. She described how Julia would brag about her ability to become whatever person a man wanted, calling it her chameleon trick. The cellmate recalled Julia's particular interest in wealthy tech entrepreneurs, saying she considered them ideal targets because they were often socially awkward and eager for genuine connection. The prosecution played recordings of Julia's jail phone calls, revealing how she continued to manipulate even after her arrest. In calls to former acquaintances, she shifted between personalities seamlessly, trying to convince each person to help her access hidden accounts or move evidence. The jury watched her face as the recordings played, noting how her expression changed with each voice she used. Bank records presented during this phase of the trial showed Julia had been preparing for a massive financial coup. She had set up elaborate networks of accounts, ready to receive transfers from Henry's holdings once they were married. The prosecution demonstrated how she had planned to drain his accounts gradually, making it appear he was making bad investments rather than being robbed. As the evidence of her premeditation mounted, Julia's courthouse behavior became more concerning. She started arriving at court in disheveled clothing, her carefully maintained appearance slipping. During testimony, she would sometimes mutter to herself or laugh inappropriately. Her defense team requested a psychological evaluation, but she refused to cooperate with the court-appointed psychiatrist. The courtroom dynamics shifted dramatically when Julia decided to take the stand against her attorney's advice. Her testimony began as a masterclass in manipulation. She was poised, articulate, and seemingly sincere as she described her relationship with Henry. But under cross-examination, her facade began to crack. Prosecutor Santos methodically walked through the evidence, asking Julia to explain each contradictory piece. With each question, her responses became more erratic. She switched between personas mid-answer, sometimes speaking as the grieving fiancé, sometimes as the calculated con artist. The jury watched in fascinated horror as she seemed to forget which version of herself she was supposed to be. The breaking point came when Santos presented her with Henry's final email to his sister. In it, Henry expressed his growing suspicions and his plans to confront Julia about her lies. Julia's response was unexpected. She began speaking directly to Henry as if he were in the room, switching between apologizing and defending her actions. The judge had to call another recess as she became increasingly agitated. During her testimony, Julia inadvertently revealed details only the killer could have known. She described the exact position Henry had been in when he died, information that hadn't been made public. She talked about the sound the wrench made, catching herself mid-sentence as she realized what she was admitting. Her attorneys sat helplessly as their client's testimony transformed into a de facto confession. The prosecution presented new surveillance footage showing Julia's activities in the days following Henry's death. She was captured on cameras at high-end boutiques, shopping for clothes and jewelry using Henry's credit cards. The timestamps showed she had gone shopping just hours after killing him, her behavior showing no signs of distress or trauma. Forensic psychiatrists who reviewed recordings of Julia's testimony and jail behavior provided expert analysis. They described her as a sophisticated psychopath who had learned to mimic normal human emotions but couldn't maintain the act under pressure. Her breakdown in court wasn't from guilt or remorse, they explained, but from the frustration of losing control of her carefully constructed narrative. The evidence about her past became even more damaging when investigators located her childhood records. They revealed a pattern of manipulation and deception starting in her early teens. School reports described her ability to charm teachers while bullying classmates, always managing to appear innocent when confronted. Her teenage years included multiple incidents of fraud and identity theft, all handled in juvenile court and sealed until now. Julia's former therapist, released from confidentiality by court order, testified about sessions from years earlier. The therapist described Julia's lack of empathy and her view of relationships as transactions. She had openly discussed her plans to find a wealthy man to manipulate, seeing nothing wrong with her intentions. The therapy had ended when Julia decided she wasn't getting useful tips for improving her cons. The prosecution's forensic accountant presented a detailed analysis of Julia's financial planning. He showed how she had created a complex web of accounts and investments, all designed to slowly siphon away Henry's fortune after their marriage. The level of financial sophistication impressed even veteran fraud investigators, who noted that she could have been a successful, legitimate businesswoman with her skills. As the final pieces of evidence were presented, Julia's behavior became increasingly unpredictable. She would appear in court some days as the polished professional she'd pretended to be, other days as a disheveled mess. Guards reported she spent nights in her cell practicing different voices and personalities, as if she could no longer remember which one was real. The most damaging testimony came from Henry's artificial intelligence assistant, which had recorded conversations in his home office. The system had captured Julia practicing different versions of her story after the murder, trying to perfect her reactions for.
When she reported him missing,
The recordings showed her calculating performance rather than genuine grief. The defense team's final attempts to salvage their case fell apart when Julia began contradicting their arguments in court. She would interrupt her own attorneys to correct details of their statements, often providing information that further incriminated her. Her need to control the narrative ultimately contributed to her own conviction, as she couldn't stop herself from trying to perfect every detail of her story, even the damaging ones. The courthouse fell silent as Michael Santos approached the jury for his closing argument. After weeks of testimony and mountains of evidence, the veteran prosecutor knew this was his moment to tie everything together. He stood quietly for a moment, letting the tension build in the packed courtroom. Henry Parker died because he discovered the truth, Santos began, his voice steady and clear. He died because he was a good man who trusted someone who had spent months, even years, preparing to betray that trust. This wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't self-defense. This was a calculated execution carried out by a predator who saw Henry not as a human being, but as a prize to be won and then eliminated. Santos methodically walked the jury through the evidence one final time. He displayed the timeline of Julia's preparation, the stalking, the research, the careful construction of her false identity. Security footage showed her buying murder supplies weeks before the crime. Bank records revealed her financial desperation. Phone records proved her careful creation of alibis. The prosecutor pulled up the last known photo of Henry, taken by his office security camera the morning of his death. He smiled at the camera as he walked in, coffee in hand, no idea that he had less than 2 hours to live. "This is the man Julia Martinez murdered," Santos said. "Not just his body, but his trust, his hopes, his dreams of having a family." Julia sat at the defense table, switching between personas even now. One moment she dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, playing the role of the grieving fiancée. The next, she stared coldly at the prosecutor, her mask slipping to reveal the calculator beneath. The jury watched these transitions with growing unease. The defense's closing argument felt hollow in comparison. James Morrison did his best with an impossible case, trying to paint Julia as a troubled woman who had lost control in a moment of panic. But the evidence of premeditation was too strong, the proof of her calculations too clear. Even as he spoke, Julia undermined him by muttering corrections to his version of events, unable to stop herself from trying to perfect the story. Santos's rebuttal was devastating. He played the hardware store security footage one final time, Julia calmly buying cleaning supplies and garbage bags the day before the murder. "Watch her," he instructed the jury. "Watch how carefully she selects each item. Does this look like a woman who killed in self-defense? Or does this look like someone who knew exactly what she was going to do?" The prosecution's final piece of evidence was Henry's last email to his sister, never sent, found in his drafts folder. "Something's wrong," he had written. "I'm meeting with Steve tomorrow to go over what he found. If anything happens to me, everything you need is in the blue folder in my office safe." That meeting with his private investigator never happened. Julia had made sure of that. Detective Chin sat in the front row as Santos concluded his argument. She had worked hundreds of homicide cases, but this one was different. The calculated nature of the crime, the psychological manipulation, the complete lack of remorse, it represented a level of evil she rarely encountered. The jury watched as Julia's carefully constructed world finally fell apart. During Santos's closing argument, she began speaking out loud, arguing with him, switching between her various personas. The judge had to warn her repeatedly to be quiet. Her own attorneys couldn't control her as the facade she'd maintained for so long cracked completely. Santos ended with a simple statement. Henry Parker trusted Julia Martinez with his heart, his home, and his future. She repaid that trust with manipulation, lies, and finally, murder. Don't let her manipulate you too. The evidence speaks for itself. Henry Parker deserves justice. As the jury filed out to begin deliberations, Julia's behavior became increasingly erratic. She demanded to address the court, tried to fire her attorneys, and insisted she could explain everything if people would just listen. The judge finally had her removed from the courtroom, her voice echoing down the hallway as deputies led her away. The jury took less than 6 hours to reach their verdict. In similar cases, such a quick decision usually meant good news for the defense. Juries that found guilt beyond reasonable doubt typically needed more time to review the evidence. But everyone in the courtroom knew this case was different. The evidence wasn't just convincing, it was overwhelming. When Julia was brought back in for the verdict, she had transformed again. Gone was the disheveled woman from closing arguments. She appeared perfectly groomed, wearing a conservative black dress and pearl earrings that eerily matched what Henry's mother had worn in old photos. It was one final performance, but no one was buying it anymore. The courtroom fell silent as the jury foreman stood. Time seemed to slow as he handed the verdict form to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. The judge reviewed it silently, his face giving nothing away, before handing it back. The tension in the room was palpable. In the matter of the state of California versus Julia Martinez, on the count of first-degree murder, we the jury find the defendant. The foreman's voice was clear and firm. Guilty. Julia's reaction was unlike anything the veteran courtroom staff had ever seen. She began laughing, not the polished social laugh she'd perfected for Henry's business events, but a harsh, uncontrolled sound. Then she started speaking in different voices, cycling through her various personas. The grieving fiancé begged for mercy. The cold calculator demanded appeals. The real Julia, whoever she was, seemed lost in the chaos of her own creation. Henry's family sat quietly as the verdict was read, holding hands and crying silently. Rachel, his sister, later told reporters that the verdict brought relief, but not closure. "Henry is still gone," she said. "Nothing can bring him back. But at least she can't do this to anyone else." The judge scheduled the sentencing for the following week, but everyone knew what was coming. First-degree murder with special circumstances of lying in wait and financial gain carried only one possible sentence in California. Julia would spend the rest of her life in prison, with no possibility of parole. At the sentencing hearing, Henry's family members gave emotional impact statements. Rachel spoke about her last conversation with her brother, how he had sensed something was wrong but tried to handle it privately to avoid embarrassment. His best friend talked about Henry's dreams of having a family, dreams that Julia had exploited and destroyed. Julia's statement to the court was bizarre and rambling. She switched between apologizing to Henry and defending her actions, between claiming love and admitting calculation. The judge had to interrupt her several times as she slipped between personalities, her grip on reality seeming to fade with each transition. The judge's sentencing statement was brief, but powerful. He spoke about breach of trust, about the calculated nature of the crime, about the complete lack of remorse. When he pronounced the sentence, life in prison without possibility of parole, Julia showed no reaction. She seemed lost in her own world, perhaps cycling through her collection of personas, looking for one that could get her out of this situation. As deputies led her away, Julia turned to look at Henry's family one last time. For a moment, her mask dropped completely, and everyone in the courtroom saw what Henry had seen in his final moments, the cold, calculating predator behind the carefully constructed facade. Then she was gone, leaving behind a courtroom full of people forever changed by her deception. The media circus that had surrounded the trial began to pack up. Reporters filed their final stories about the Black Widow of Beverly Hills. True crime podcasts began planning special episodes. Hollywood producers started making calls about movie rights. But for those closest to the case, there was only emptiness and grief. Detective Chin watched Julia being led away to begin her sentence. The detective had seen many killers in her career, but few as calculated as Julia. She didn't just kill Henry, Chin told her partner. She killed Julia Martinez too, and Amanda Pierce, and whoever else she pretended to be. The scary part is, I don't think even she knows who she really is anymore. 6 months after Julia's conviction, Rachel Parker stood in her brother's empty house, preparing it for sale. Every room held memories of Henry, but also shadows of Julia's deception. The garage had been completely renovated, its concrete floor replaced, but Rachel still couldn't bring herself to park there. Some stains, she had learned, never really wash away. Henry's legacy, however, would be more than just a cautionary tale. Rachel had spent months working with his company's board to establish the Henry Parker Foundation, dedicated to protecting vulnerable people from financial predators. The foundation offered free background check services to people in new relationships and funded research into fraud prevention and victim support. The impact of the case rippled through Beverly Hills and beyond. Private investigators reported a surge in requests for background checks on potential partners. Dating apps added verification features. Financial advisors developed new protocols for protecting clients from romantic manipulation. Henry's death had exposed a vulnerability in the digital age, the ease with which someone could create a completely false identity. Julia's case became a landmark study in forensic psychology. Her ability to maintain multiple personas, each with its own detailed backstory and mannerisms, fascinated researchers. Recordings of her trial testimony, showing her rapid switches between identities, were used to train law enforcement officers in recognizing signs of personality manipulation. Detective Chen gave lectures at police academies about the case, teaching new investigators how to spot signs of long-term predatory behavior. She emphasized the patience Julia had shown in stalking Henry, the meticulous research she had done to make herself his perfect match. The scariest predators, she would tell her students, are the ones who make you love them before they strike. Henry's company emerged stronger from the tragedy. His team dedicated themselves to honoring his vision, developing new cybersecurity tools to protect against identity theft and financial fraud. The company established a yearly scholarship in his name, supporting students who wanted to use technology to make the world safer. The media attention gradually faded, but the case left lasting changes in how wealthy individuals approached relationships. Prenuptial agreements became standard practice, not just to protect assets but to verify identities. Law firms developed specialized services for vetting potential partners, combining traditional background checks with social media analysis and identity verification. Rachel found unexpected purpose in sharing her brother's story. She spoke at conferences about financial security and emotional manipulation, helping others recognize the warning signs she had missed. Her talks always ended with a photo of Henry, not the grim crime scene photos that had dominated the news, but a picture of him laughing at a family barbecue, full of life and hope. The investigation team's methods became a model for handling similar cases. Their careful preservation of digital evidence, their attention to financial details, and their psychological profiling techniques were adopted by other departments. Julia's case showed how modern murders could be solved through a combination of traditional police work and digital forensics. Henry's friends honored his memory by continuing his charitable work. The coding program for underprivileged kids that had so impressed Julia, or had seemed to, grew into a national initiative. Students in the program learned not just coding but digital literacy and online safety, turning Henry's tragedy into a force for positive change. Julia's storage units, filled with the tools of her deception, became a training resource for law enforcement. Investigators studied her methods, the careful organization of false documents, the detailed dossiers on potential targets, the multiple sets of identification in various stages of completion. Understanding her techniques helped them protect future victims. The case changed how people thought about love and trust in the digital age. Henry's story showed that even the most successful, intelligent people could be vulnerable to emotional manipulation. It wasn't about being naive or foolish. It was about the sophisticated techniques predators like Julia had developed to exploit basic human needs for connection and understanding. In prison, Julia's behavior continued to fascinate psychiatrists. She moved between personas like changing channels on a TV, sometimes being the remorseful fiancé, sometimes the cold calculator, sometimes personalities she had created for other cons. Guards learned to track which version of Julia they were dealing with by subtle changes in her posture and speech patterns. The prison psychiatrist's reports described her as living in a hall of mirrors, each reflection showing a different version of herself. She wrote letters to Henry as if he were alive, sent wedding planning ideas to his family, and sometimes insisted she was the real victim. Her grip on reality seemed to loosen as the months passed, the lies she had lived for so long becoming her only truth. Rachel visited Julia once, a year after the conviction. She wanted to understand what had happened to her brother, to see the real person behind the masks. But Julia gave her nothing, cycling through personalities throughout their conversation, unable or unwilling to show her true self. Rachel left knowing that the real Julia, if she had ever existed, was lost in the labyrinth of her own deceptions. The case files became required reading at FBI training programs, particularly the detailed analysis of Julia's digital footprint. Her methods of creating and maintaining false identities helped authorities understand how modern predators operated. The techniques she had used to research and stalk Henry were studied to develop better protection protocols. Henry's death led to changes in how technology companies approached identity verification. His own company developed new algorithms for detecting patterns of deceptive behavior online. Social media platforms improved their methods for confirming user identities. Dating apps added layers of verification that might have exposed Julia's false identity before she could strike. The Henry Parker Foundation's work expanded beyond just protecting potential victims. They funded research into the psychology of predators like Julia, trying to understand how they chose their targets and maintain their deceptions. The Foundation's findings helped develop new strategies for identifying and stopping similar predators before they could cause harm. 3 years after the trial, Rachel published a book about her brother's case. It wasn't just about his murder. It was about who he had been, his kindness, his dreams, his trust in people. The book became a bestseller, not for its account of Julia's crimes, but for its exploration of how love and trust survive even in the face of betrayal. Henry's story changed how many people approached relationships, but not always in negative ways. His case taught people to be cautious but not paranoid, to verify but still remain open to connection. As Rachel often said in her talks, the lesson isn't to stop trusting. It's to trust wisely, to pay attention to the small signs that something isn't right. The garage where Henry died was eventually converted into a community center, a place where people could learn about online safety and financial protection. The building that had housed such darkness became a source of light and education, helping others avoid similar fates. Julia's own story faded into prison routine. She received no visitors except psychiatrists studying her case. Her letters to Henry's family eventually stopped. The woman who had wanted so desperately to be part of their world became a ghost, fading into the system that would hold her for the rest of her life. But Henry's legacy lived on in the lives he had touched and the changes his death had inspired. His foundation helped countless potential victims avoid similar fates. His company's innovations made the digital world safer. His story taught others to balance trust with wisdom, to remain open to love while staying alert to deception. The final word belonged to Rachel, who ended her book with a message of hope. Henry's trust in people wasn't a weakness. It was his strength, his gift to the world. Julia may have taken his life, but she couldn't take that legacy. In the end, love and truth prevail. They always do.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.